Early morning. An immigrant neighborhood kitchen. Sometime in the first half of the 20th century. The house is quiet. The rest of the family is still asleep. A woman opens the pantry door. She checks what remains. A container of beans. A sack of flour. Rice. A tin of olive oil, lower than it was last week. A few vegetables, chosen because they'd keep. Something preserved from a season that has already passed. Jarred, sealed, waiting for the month it was set aside for. Nothing here is wasted. Nothing here is accidental. She knows what needs to be used first, because it won't last much longer. She knows what can wait another week. She knows what will need to be bought, and roughly what it will cost. And she knows, almost without having to think about it, how many meals the family can get out of what is already sitting on these shelves. This isn't a modern budgeting spreadsheet. There is no app tracking any of it. No financial planner drew up this system. No bank statement reflects the work being done here. And yet the system works. It has to. There isn't much room for it not to. What if one of the most important money management systems in an immigrant household wasn't kept in a bank account, but in the kitchen? And why were so many of these household habits passed from mother to daughter without ever being written down at all? Chapter 1. Arriving with very little. Greek immigration to the United States did not happen all at once, and it did not happen to one kind of family. People arrived from mainland villages, from island communities, from cities and rural regions with different economies, different dialects, different relationships to the Orthodox Church, and different reasons for leaving. Some left in the earliest wave around the turn of the 20th century. Others arrived decades later, under entirely different circumstances. Grouping all of them into a single story flattens a history that was, in reality, made of many overlapping ones. What many of these families shared, at least at the start, was very little money. Men often arrived first, taking whatever work was available in a new country where language was a barrier and discrimination was a daily reality. Restaurant work, food service, confectionery and candy making, shoe shining, small retail, factory labor. These were common entry points, not because they represented any particular ambition, but because they were among the few doors that opened. Some of these workers eventually saved enough to open small businesses of their own, a diner, a grocery, a candy shop, and some of those businesses became the foundation of real economic stability, even multi-generational success. Others never got that far. Wages were unstable. Work could disappear without warning. Housing in immigrant neighborhoods was often crowded and expensive relative to income, and layered on top of all of it was an obligation many immigrants carried, whether they wanted to or not. Relatives back home, sometimes an entire village, who were counting on money being sent across the ocean. Under those conditions, a household could not afford to be careless. Every dollar that came in had a job to do before it was spent, and often more than one job. That pressure is where this story actually begins, not in a cookbook, but in a family budget that had almost no room for error. Chapter 2. The kitchen as a financial office. Here is the central idea of this documentary. In many of these households, the kitchen wasn't only the place where food was prepared. It functioned as something closer to a financial office, the place where household resources were tracked, allocated, and converted into meals, with almost nothing left over. The woman running that kitchen, and in the vast majority of documented cases, this labor fell to women, could typically tell you, without checking anything written down, how much flour was left, how much oil remained in the tin, which vegetables were in season and therefore cheap, which leftovers needed to be used before they spoiled, what could be preserved for later, and what would need to be purchased before the week was out. This was inventory management. It just didn't look like inventory management because it didn't happen at a desk. It's worth being precise about where this knowledge came from, because it wasn't formal training. It was observation and repetition, watching a mother or grandmother do this work, absorbing the logic of it slowly, over years, until the calculations became instinct rather than arithmetic. A household could run for decades on knowledge that never once appeared on paper. That absence of documentation matters for how this history gets told today. Financial history, as it's usually written, tends to follow money that left a paper trail. Bank deposits, business ledgers, wage records. The kind of resource management happening in these kitchens rarely generated any paper trail at all. It shows up instead in oral histories, family memoirs, and the occasional line in a settlement house report, which is part of why this side of immigrant economic life has been so easy to overlook. Chapter 3. Buying ingredients, not convenience. One of the clearest financial strategies in this system was simple to state and demanding to execute. Buy basic ingredients, not finished convenience. Rather than purchasing meals that were already prepared, households bought staples and did the transformation work themselves, at home, with their own labor standing in for money they didn't have to spend. The specific ingredients varied enormously by region, income, and era, and it would be inaccurate to claim a single universal Greek immigrant pantry. But certain categories of food recur across immigrant-era household accounts generally, Greek and otherwise: dried beans and lentils, rice, flour, potatoes, whatever vegetables were in season, bread, eggs, olive oil where it was available and affordable, and inexpensive cuts of meat used carefully and often stretched across more than one meal. The economic logic wasn't about any single ingredient. It was about versatility. A household under financial pressure had strong reasons to favor ingredients that could perform multiple jobs. A bean that could anchor a soup one night and a side dish 2 nights later. A portion of bread that could be fresh today and transformed into something else once it wasn't. This wasn't unique to Greek households. It was, broadly, how working-class and immigrant households across many different backgrounds managed food budgets in this era. What made the Greek-American version distinct wasn't the underlying economic strategy. It was the specific culinary vocabulary layered on top of it. The particular vegetables, the particular use of olive oil, the particular dishes that Greek families built out of the exact same economic constraints everyone around them was working within. Chapter 4. The leftover wasn't left over. There's a mental shift worth naming directly, because it explains a lot of what follows. In many of these households, what a modern kitchen would call a leftover wasn't treated as an afterthought. It was often planned from the start. A household might deliberately cook a larger quantity of something specifically because it was going to become tomorrow's meal, not because there'd been a miscalculation. The underlying principle was straightforward. Waste was expensive, and a household with limited money could not treat food the way a wealthier household might. Food could be reheated. It could be transformed. Yesterday's vegetables becoming today's soup, a portion of grain becoming the base of something else entirely. It could be preserved for later use. It could be shared with neighbors or relatives, which turned a potential surplus into a social investment rather than spoilage. And it could simply become an ingredient in a future dish, its identity changing even as its usefulness continued. It's worth resisting the temptation here to describe this as a set of secret family recipes, because that overstates and mystifies what was, at its core, a practical economic principle applied through cooking. The specific dishes varied by family, region, and generation. The principle, plan for reuse, don't let anything become disposable by accident, was the consistent part. Refrigeration, when it eventually arrived in these households, made this kind of planning considerably easier. But it's important to understand that the underlying habit of resourcefulness predates the appliance. Families were doing this work before they had a refrigerator to help them do it, using root cellars, ice boxes, and simply the discipline of cooking in quantities that matched how quickly food would actually be eaten. The surprising part is that some of the most powerful savings in these households weren't created by earning more money. They were created by making the same food perform more than one job. How much money could a family save if almost nothing in the kitchen was considered disposable? Chapter 5. The pantry was a form of savings. If the kitchen was a financial office, the pantry was its savings account. Stored food, dried beans and grains, flour, preserved vegetables, fruit preserves, olive oil, and other staples depending on season and household circumstance, functioned as a kind of security against the uncertainty that defined so much of immigrant economic life. Wages could disappear. A season could be harder than expected. A family emergency could eat into whatever cash reserves existed. A well-stocked pantry meant a family wasn't entirely at the mercy of daily purchasing power. But this security wasn't free, and it's worth being honest about the cost, because it's easy to romanticize. Preservation required real labor, hours spent preparing, cooking down, sealing, and storing food, almost always performed by women whose time was, in a strict economic sense, uncompensated. It required storage space, which was not a given in crowded urban immigrant housing. And it required knowledge, knowing what would preserve well, what wouldn't, and how to do it safely. In effect, these households were trading time and labor for greater food security. That's a real trade, not a magic trick. The pantry didn't create resources out of nothing. It converted one scarce thing, a woman's unpaid time, into another scarce thing the family needed more urgently, a buffer against hunger and financial shock. Chapter 6. Seasonal Buying. Seasonality was another lever these households pulled, and it connects directly back to the pantry. Food prices and availability fluctuated with the seasons in ways that are largely invisible to a modern shopper used to a supermarket stocking the same produce year-round. A vegetable or fruit that was abundant and cheap during its natural season could be scarce and expensive months later if it was available at all. A household that could preserve seasonal abundance through canning, drying, salting, or other methods common to the era, effectively transformed a temporary price advantage into a resource that lasted well beyond its original season. That's a meaningful shift in how to think about these families, not simply as consumers spending whatever money came in, but as partially productive units, converting labor and timing into food that would otherwise have had to be purchased later at a worse price. This principle wasn't specific to Greek immigrant households. It appears across rural American communities, other immigrant groups, and working-class households broadly throughout this era. What's specifically Greek-American here is not the strategy of seasonal preservation itself, but the particular foods being preserved and the culinary traditions shaping how they were used once preserved. The economic logic was shared. The pantry's contents reflected a specific culture. Access to seasonality, though, wasn't the same for every family, and that distinction matters. Households with access to even a small plot of land, a backyard garden, a shared community lot, or land attached to a family business, had a direct relationship to the growing season. They could plan purchases and preservation around what they were producing themselves, reducing dependence on a merchant's prices altogether for at least part of the year. Urban families without that access were more dependent on neighborhood markets and grocers, which meant seasonal savings had to be captured differently. Buying in larger quantities when a particular vegetable or fruit was at its cheapest, then doing the preservation work at home to extend that price advantage. Where they existed, Greek immigrant neighborhoods, and the small grocers and produce sellers who served them, could also function as informal seasonal information networks. A family might learn from a neighbor, a grocer, or a fellow parishioner exactly when a particular crop was about to come into cheap abundance, and time a larger purchase accordingly. This kind of informal knowledge sharing reduced the research burden on any single household and is broadly consistent with how immigrant communities elsewhere managed similar constraints. It's worth resisting the urge to name specific crops here, as though they represent a fixed, universal Greek immigrant seasonal calendar. The reality varied by region, climate, and what local markets actually carried. What can be said with more confidence is the underlying pattern. Households were watching prices shift with the calendar and treating a temporary abundance not as something to be consumed quickly, but as raw material for a later month when the same food would cost more or disappear from the market altogether. Chapter 7. Hospitality cost money. Here the story runs into a genuine contradiction, and it's worth sitting with it rather than resolving it too quickly. Greek family and community culture, as documented in numerous oral histories and community accounts, often placed strong importance on hospitality, feeding guests generously, hosting extended family for religious holidays and celebrations, treating a full table as a matter of dignity rather than optional generosity. But hospitality, by definition, costs money. Feeding more people than the immediate household requires more food, more labor, and more planning. For a family already operating with very little slack in the budget, this could have been a serious financial strain. The way many households appear to have managed this tension was not by abandoning hospitality, but by applying the same frugal logic to it. Cooking at home, rather than purchasing prepared food for guests. Preparing large quantities that stretched inexpensive ingredients across many servings. Relying on family labor rather than paid help. Drawing on the same seasonal and preserved foods the household was already managing for its own daily needs. In other words, the kitchen that was built to stretch a limited grocery budget was the same kitchen that made generosity possible. That's the paradox worth naming clearly. Being frugal in this context did not mean being ungenerous. For many of these families, frugality was precisely what made generosity affordable. But there was another financial system operating inside many of these immigrant households, one that had almost nothing to do with food itself. What happened when a family's greatest financial resource wasn't money, but relatives? Chapter 8. Family as an economic network. Extended family, in many documented immigrant communities, functioned as something close to an informal financial institution. Depending on the specific family and circumstance, relatives could share housing, reducing individual rent burdens. They could share childcare, allowing more adults in a household to work for wages. They could share meals, transportation, household labor, and, in cases where a family ran a business, the responsibilities of keeping that business running. This network could become especially important during moments of crisis. A period of unemployment, an illness, a childbirth, a relocation to a new city, a sudden financial emergency. A relative who could offer temporary housing, a loan, or simply an extra set of hands during a hard stretch was providing something with real economic value, even if no money technically changed hands, or no interest was ever charged. It's important, though, not to overstate this into a universal picture. Not every family had this kind of network available. Some immigrants arrived with few or no relatives already in the country. Some family relationships were strained by conflict, distance, or the simple pressures of everyone struggling at once. Geography mattered too. A relative who could have helped, but lived hundreds of miles away, offered a different kind of support than one living down the street. The accurate claim here isn't that Greek immigrant families always had this safety net. It's that where these networks existed and functioned well, they operated as a genuine form of economic resilience, one that doesn't show up in a bank ledger, but mattered just as much as one that did. Chapter 9. Women's unpaid labor. It's worth stating this plainly, because it's easy to let it stay implicit throughout a documentary like this one. And implicit is not the same as acknowledged. The woman managing this kitchen, cooking from scratch rather than buying prepared food, preserving seasonal produce, repairing and reusing clothing and household goods, tracking purchases, planning meals around what needed to be used first, caring for children, and maintaining the household's pantry, was producing real economic value for her family. Her labor directly reduced what the household had to spend. Every meal made from scratch rather than purchased ready-made was money saved. Every preserved jar of vegetables was a future grocery expense avoided. Every piece of clothing mended rather than replaced was a purchase deferred. And yet, because this work typically didn't come with a paycheck, it tends to disappear from conventional financial history. Census records might list a household's male wage earner and his occupation in detail, while leaving the economic contribution of the household's food and domestic management essentially invisible, present in the family's survival, absent from the ledger. This matters beyond historical accuracy. It challenges a narrow definition of saving money that equates it only with earning more of it. In these households, saving money was frequently a form of production, carried out largely by women, and it deserves to be counted as economic labor rather than treated as a background detail to the real financial story. Chapter 10. The Second Generation. As the children of these immigrants grew up in America, they encountered a very different economic landscape than the one their parents had arrived into. Supermarkets began replacing small ethnic grocers and open-air markets. Packaged and prepared foods became widely available and, over time, increasingly affordable. Refrigerators and eventually freezers changed what storage and meal planning even required. Advertising actively promoted convenience as a value in itself, sometimes directly at odds with the frugal habits their parents had built entire households around. The response wasn't uniform. Some second-generation Greek Americans held on to the household habits they'd grown up watching: cooking from scratch, maintaining a garden, preserving seasonal food, treating them as identity as much as economy. Others set those habits aside almost entirely, embracing the convenience their parents' generation had never had access to. Many did some combination of both, keeping certain practices for holidays and family gatherings while adopting supermarket convenience for daily life. This is the point in the story where these habits begin to quietly stop being passed down in some families, not because they'd stopped working, but because the economic conditions that had made them necessary were changing underneath the next generation's feet. Chapter 11. What Modern Life Made Easy. It's worth being clear-eyed about what changed, rather than treating this as a simple story of decline. Refrigeration solved real, long-standing problems around food safety and storage. Mass production made a much wider range of foods available at prices that, for many households, were genuinely lower than the cost of preparing the same thing from scratch. Supermarkets consolidated shopping into something faster and more convenient than visiting multiple small merchants. Appliances reduced the sheer number of labor hours a household needed to spend on food preparation. Restaurants and faster transportation opened up options that simply hadn't existed before. These were real improvements, and it would be dishonest to frame them only as loss, but something did go with them. As frugality became less strictly necessary for many households, some of the specific knowledge that had made these earlier kitchens function, how to preserve a particular vegetable, how to stretch a particular cut of meat, how to plan a week of meals around what was already in the pantry, had fewer reasons to be actively practiced, and therefore fewer reasons to be actively taught. This wasn't a single decision made at one moment. It happened gradually, meal by meal, across years, in ways that would have been almost impossible to notice from inside any one household. A daughter who grew up watching her mother preserve a season's worth of vegetables might, in her own household 20 years later, find that a supermarket could simply sell her the same vegetable in January for a price that made the labor of preserving it hard to justify. The math had changed, and when the math changes, habits built around the old math don't necessarily get defended. They just quietly stop being the default choice. None of this required anyone to reject their upbringing or their family's traditions outright. Many of these habits survived in a narrower form, reserved for holidays, for cultural identity, for the specific dishes that carried meaning beyond their economics. What tended to fade first wasn't the culture attached to the practices. It was the everyday, unglamorous economic function they had originally served. The plain fact that a family had once depended on this knowledge simply to make it through a given month. Return to the kitchen. The pantry shelf. The cutting board, worn smooth in the center. An old recipe, never written down the same way twice. A jar, reused for another season. A reused container, doing its third or fourth job. The family table, set for more people than strictly needed to be fed. The real story here isn't that Greek immigrant families possessed some secret financial wisdom that everyone else lacked. It's that households facing limited resources, Greek and otherwise, developed systems for making what they had go further. They didn't necessarily have more money. They had fewer things they were willing to waste. A meal could become tomorrow's meal. A seasonal harvest could become winter food. A relative could become a safety net. A kitchen could become a budget. Much of this knowledge was never written into a financial textbook. It lived in kitchens. It passed quietly from one generation to another, until modern life made many of those lessons seem unnecessary. What if the frugal habits we think of as old-fashioned were actually survival skills, developed by people who couldn't afford to waste anything? Fade to black. Sometimes the best financial advice isn't found in a bank. Sometimes it's sitting quietly in an old family kitchen. If this kind of history is something you want more of, subscribe. It's what keeps this channel going. Comment below with a household habit from your own family that never made it into a history book.